Hey guys, welcome back. Got some more news for you. All right, Mr. Al-Sistani leaves the hospital after the approval of a medical team. The Supreme Religious Authority, Grand Ayatollah Al-Sistani, on Friday left the hospital in Karbala. A medical source said in a statement to Information that the Supreme Authority left the hospital after the approval of the medical team after being satisfied with his health and stability. An official source in the office of the Supreme Authority announced yesterday Sistani suffered a sprain in the left leg that led to a fractured thigh bone, and surgery was performed for the Supreme Authority yesterday in the hospital in Karbala after he was transferred from his home to Najaf. Advisor to Abdul Mahdi, the China agreement is the most important in the history of Iraq. The advisor to the Prime Minister of Economic Energy Affairs, Abdul Hussein Al-Hanan, Friday considered that the Iraqi-Chinese agreement is the most important in the history of Iraq, indicating that recent events directly affected its implementation. Yeah, it's called an RI, guys. They're waiting on it. That's the effect of its implementation, is waiting for the RI. The official Iraqi news agency, Conscience, quoted Al-Hanan as saying that Iraq required Chinese companies to implement projects with global American and European technology, noting that the government will not accept a second-class project, but rather first-class projects and serve the community. He added, there are 40 major Chinese companies ready with all capabilities, financially and technically guaranteed at the practical level, capable of carrying out major works in the field of roads, bridges, and city building. Al-Hanan said some people described in the agreement as pledging Iraq oil, and this is not correct, because it is a guarantee for selling oil for a long time, and it is a major achievement, noting that this agreement includes the implementation of projects on the principle of oil for construction and reconstruction. Now, notice right there, guys. Notice how Iraq is using oil to pay for some of their infrastructure, reconstruction, and repair. So they're actually not using budget money and that kind of thing. So they're actually using oil, but even though they're using oil, they still have to and are waiting for the rate change, okay? Because oil is acting as their currency or as payment in place in lieu of their currency, so they still are waiting on the rate change to perform those tasks and steps and engage that contract with China. Al-Hanan pointed out that Iraq will pay 100,000 barrels per day, equivalent to the price of the oil market, $6 million per day, and by $180 million per month, noting that the agreement rate of oil is 10% of Iraqi oil exports to China, which reaches millions of barrels per day. And he added that recent events directly affected the implementation of the agreement, noting that it was hoped that the China-Iraq forum would take place in Baghdad on 11/17 of last year for a period of 4 days, but it was postponed and replaced by small workshops that will take place these days in coordination with the Chamber of Chinese Trade, Chinese embassy, prime ministers, and other ministers. Al-Hanan went on to say the ministers had issued a book a few days ago requesting ministries and governments, including the Kurdistan region, to update their previous data and prepare for the completion of the projects related to infrastructure in all sectors. Usually the agreement with China that it is one of the most important agreements that occurred in the history of Iraq. The advisor to the Prime Minister of Financial Affairs, the appearance of Mohammed Saleh, new details on the most important offer on the agreement between Iraq and China, indicating that the agreement will focus on the implementation of infrastructure. Saleh said in a press statement the agreement includes the exchange of oil revenues for the implementation of projects in Iraq, noting that the Iraq government opened up a credit account in one of the sober Chinese banks to deposit oil revenues of 100,000 barrels per day with Chinese. He added that this account is spent on companies that implement projects, noting the agreement will focus on infrastructure projects such as schools, hospitals, roads, electricity, sanitation, to be determined through the Ministry of Planning in coordination with the Council of Ministers. Saleh added that the agreement will provide many job opportunities for the unemployed and give opportunity to the Iraqi private sector companies, as well as relying on Iraqi products to implement projects such as cement, brick, sand, others, noting that this will create significant economic development in the country and that the age of the agreement reaches 20 years, stressing that this agreement will revive the infrastructure of Iraq, which has been destroyed for decades. U.S. Treasury grants 90 days to end Iranian deals imposed on it with new sanctions. The U.S. Treasury announced today, Thursday, a 90-day grace period to end deals in some sectors of the Iranian economy that were imposed on new U.S. sanctions last week. According to the Treasury website, the period ending on April 9th will allow deals to be closed in construction, mining, manufacturing, and textile sectors of Iran's economy that may fall under the sanctions, although new business will remain prohibited. And the United States imposed more sanctions on Iran on Friday in retaliation for its missile attack on U.S. forces in Iraq last week, and vowed to tightening economic restrictions in Tehran continues to carry out terrorist acts or seeks a nuclear bomb. Sanctions targeting the manufacturing, mining, and textile sectors, as well as senior Iranian officials who Washington said were involved in the January 8th attack on the missile bases where U.S. forces were present. And hey guys, just so you know, I have 2 additional articles on currency swap trade deals between Zimbabwe and China. God bless you guys and have a great day. Here's the Dow Jones. It had nice movement after the China-U.S. trade agreement, phase 1 signing agreement, with Donald Trump. Right now it's about 29,300. Let's see how close it gets to 30,000 points by around mid-March.
Zimbabwe and China signed currency swap deal. China has such agreements with 20 countries, including SAE, and hopes the move will improve trade with the embattled Zimbabwe. Harare, Zimbabwe and China have signed a currency swap deal in a move expected to bolster trade between the two countries, following a visit by Chinese Foreign Affairs Minister Wang Yi to Harare. To promote international use of the yuan, China has signed currency swap agreements with more than 20 countries around the world, including SAE. A currency swap involves the exchange of money in one currency for the same in another currency, and companies doing business abroad often use it to get more favorable loan rates. Wang, who is on a 5-nation tour to Africa, ended his visit in Zimbabwe this week with the two countries agreeing to enhance trade and economic cooperation. Zimbabwe relies heavily on China to fund its main infrastructure projects, as the country does not qualify for funding from international financial institutions due to its debts. China is funding projects worth more than $2 billion, about 29 billion, in Zimbabwe, including expansion of the country's main power plant, refurbishment of the central airport, and construction of a new parliament building for a planned new city on the outskirts of Harare. Speaking to journalists in Harare at the end of Wang's visit, Zimbabwe's finance minister Mthuli Ncube said a currency swap will boost trade between the two countries. "We have entered into a currency swap arrangement. What this means is that there are those who would be investing in Zimbabwe from China and those who require their proceeds to be remitted back to China," said Ncube. "The idea is those individuals will then swap currency so that those who are investing in Zimbabwe are able to give them a domestic currency, and they use the foreign currency, which they are bringing in for investment, to pay those who are exiting." Ncube said the currency swap will help his government strengthen its capacity to honor its liabilities to China. Better for Zimbabwe. Harare-based economist John Robertson said the currency swap will favor Zimbabwe. "It looks like it's a way of seeking to borrow more money from the Chinese. Zimbabwe's currency is very unstable and is not recognized anywhere except locally, so it is Zimbabwe that is going to benefit more." Other African countries, apart from SAE, that have a currency swap with China, include Nigeria and Ghana. In his remarks at the end of his visit to Africa soon after meeting President Emmerson Mnangagwa, Wang said the volume of trade between China and Africa exceeded $200 billion in 2019. China has been Africa's largest trading partner for 11 years in a row. China's stock of indirect investment has reached $110 billion, and more than 3,700 Chinese enterprises have invested and started businesses in various parts of Africa, providing a strong driving force for sustained economic growth in Africa. Wang also castigated critics of China's relations with Africa, saying Beijing is sincere in its partnership with the continent. "We have always insisted on non-interference in internal affairs, no political conditions, and never forcing others to do anything difficult, and we have always paid attention to listening to the voices of Africa. Respected Africa's will and been in line with Africa's needs." Wang also visited Egypt, Djibouti, Eritrea, and Burundi. Zimbabwe signs currency swap deal with China. Washington. Zimbabwe has joined Japan, South Africa, and Nigeria in signing a currency swap deal with China, which it hopes will improve trade between the two countries. Zimbabwe Finance Minister Professor Mthuli Ncube confirmed the deal in an interview with the state media on the sidelines of a meeting between Zimbabwean President Emmerson Mnangagwa and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi at the State House in Harare. The top Chinese official is on a 5 African nation diplomatic offensive taking him to Egypt, Djibouti, Eritrea, Burundi and Zimbabwe. Beijing says the visit marks its 2 decades of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. Said Ncube, "We have entered into a currency swap arrangement. What this means is that there are those who would be investing in Zimbabwe from China and those who require their proceeds to be remitted back to China, which is normal." He added, "So, the idea is those individuals will then swap currency, so that those who are investing in Zimbabwe are able to give them a domestic currency and they use the foreign currency which they are bringing in for investment to pay those who are exiting." Harare, under targeted sanctions by Washington and the European Union, has increasingly turned to China for assistance. Some economists have warned that Beijing is creating debt traps for desperate African nations like Zimbabwe. University of Zimbabwe economics professor Tony Hawkins tells VOA Zimbabwe service that the deal shows desperation on the part of Zimbabwe to revive its struggling economy. "It's a sign of desperation of the times, really. You know, the real issue for the economy is getting some kind of international agreement, and all these policies that they're chasing after at the moment are all efforts to minimize the impact of not having access to IMF money, World Bank money, Africa Development Bank money, and so on." Hawkins says Harare must address its economic crisis and stop fiddling around the edges of the problem rather than tackling the problem. The chief executive officer of the Zimbabwe National Chamber of Commerce, Chris Mugiga, concurs, knowing fully well that Zimbabwe is in a quagmire where the currency conundrum is hitting not only business, but even the ordinary household. So, given that background, I think this current swap is an attempt to find solutions, especially to the current account deficit where China is the biggest beneficiary. As you know, we continue importing more from China than what we are selling to Beijing. Economist Dr. Godfrey Canyons of the Labor and Economic Development Research Institute of Zimbabwe says the Gresham Law, an economic term for filtering bad versus good currency, will be in full swing as the strong Chinese currency is set to chase away the weak Zimbabwe currency, known as bonds. The problem is that the one Chinese investor who is coming here to Zimbabwe may have misgivings because of the context of chronic high inflation, he adds, the context of volatility and uncertainty, which therefore implies that they may not really want to change their money in large amounts. However, investment banker Gilbert Muponda says the deal is likely to benefit Harare, which has been isolated by the West. "I think it's a welcome development because Zimbabwe has been experiencing an acute shortage of foreign currency, and this arrangement is going to reduce the demand of the US dollar. Because what it entirely means is that those people who are comfortable with receiving Chinese yuan can match their requirements with those who have the yuan as well." He continued, "The net effect is that you are going to avoid using the US dollar, which is in short supply and selling at a premium, so this is a good move by the two authorities." As you know, Zimbabwe previously used to get a lot of money in terms of balance of payment, in terms of payment support, and grants and things like that, and access to the IMF, which supported the currency. Now the lack of that support now is bringing extra pressure on the Zimbabwe dollar. Therefore, if you remove some of the people who are demanding the US dollar and they start using the Chinese yuan, it makes a lot of sense. Zimbabwe is facing its worst economic crisis in decades, characterized by hyperinflation, currency and fuel shortages, and power outages that can go for 18 hours. Nearly 8 million people, roughly half the population, are food insecure, according to the World Food Program.